This is The Writing of God with Dr. Miles Jones.
Welcome back to the main event. So this is what we know. Matthew was written in Hebrew. All the early church fathers said so. Luke was also originally written in Hebrew, although when it was translated into Greek, other things were added, and we will talk about those things. Acts, probably. I don't have any certainty on this yet, but definitely the letter to the Hebrews, the letters of Peter, of James and Jude. We have copies of those. We still have to analyze their authenticity, but they were Hebrews that didn't know Greek. So it's most likely they would have written in Hebrew, even if it was translated into Greek later on. And Revelation. Revelation is also well known to have been originally written in Hebrew because there's so much underlying idiomatic material that comes from Hebrew, not from Greek. This is how you tell. I'm a linguist. I know how this happens. When you first wrote in a foreign language, you put down the vocabulary in Spanish or French or whatever language you were trying to write in, but it didn't fool your teacher. Your teacher could see the underlying structure was basically English. That's how a linguist will go in and determine what the substrate language of the original document was. So these things have been analyzed. So a good part of the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew, and some of it, many of the letters, etc., in the Gospels of Mark and John, for example, were originally published in Greek, as far as we know. So the whole thing kind of comes from two different languages. But there was a compilation of all of the Gospels in Hebrew early in the first century, and that was available to all the Hebrews. Remember, it was a messianic affair. It was a messianic apostolic church. They were all Jewish Christians. They spoke Hebrew. They wanted the word in the Lashon Kodesh, in the holy tongue of Hebrew. And many Jews were converted by reading those. And we're going to talk about a new manuscript of the Gospels, the one written by Ibn Shaprut, by Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut, and it's called the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew. The Ibn Bohan means the touchstone. So he wrote Hebrew Matthew, and it is an accurate copy of Hebrew Matthew with nothing added in. However, it's quite clear that he says himself that it was copied from a Hebrew original that was still extant in the 14th century in Spain, and that he was also going to write Mark, Luke, and John in the same fashion. He never got around to doing this, but it makes it obvious that they were all still out there in the Middle Ages, in Sepharad, in Spain. The Hebrew Gospels still existed at that time. So the question is this authentic? Is this an authentic document? How can we tell that? Well, we have already shown how we authenticated the Hebrew Gospels from Catalonia and the Cochin Gospels. All right, so we need to compare the Shem Tov manuscript and the Hebrew Gospels from Catalonia and see what we find. Now, George Howard was the one who originally translated this manuscript. And this is about the only manuscript of the Hebrew Gospels that has been completely translated and published. That's why it's so strange for critics to say these have all been studied by scholars and there's nothing there. Move along, nothing to see here. Right? None of them have been translated yet. I should know. I'm one of those scholars who is translating these documents. And I know the other scholars, there's only about a half dozen scholars all over the world, and I know all of them, either personally or through their work. I know what they have done, what they haven't done. So I know many of these manuscripts haven't even been touched yet, so to say that it's all a done deal and we know everything about it and they're all recent translations, implying that they are all false translations, is a ridiculous statement to make. It's a deliberate deception on the part of people who are judging before any type of investigation has happened. So is the Shem Tov manuscript of Hebrew origin? Well, George Howard, the person who did the actual translation, says, it is written in a kind of Hebrew one would expect for a document in the first century. Basically, biblical Hebrew with a mix of later rabbinic vocabulary and idiom, because it's been 1,500 years. As it's copied and recopied, it's going to pick up some new vocabulary and cultural perspectives there. So he determined that it is an original Hebrew composition, and the Greek is the Greek Gospels and the Hebrew Gospels are not translations of each other, and that's a really important point. They are not translations of each other. For example, if an apostle is going to go out in the field leaving Jerusalem and he decides to leave a copy of the Hebrew Gospels behind, all he has to do is to dictate it, to have one, what they would call a scribe, translating it into Hebrew, and one translating into Greek. Now, neither one is going to be a translation of the other, right? Because the Greek scribe is going to write it down in Greek, and the Hebrew scribe is going to write it down in Hebrew. And this is the way many documents were done, by dictation rather than by copying from a manuscript that was already done. That way you could make numerous copies. If you had 4 scribes, you could make 4 copies. If you had 6 scribes, you could make 6 copies by dictation rather than passing around a single manuscript. Now we come to the Hebrew Gospels from Catalonia, which we have talked about, and we're going to talk a little more about them. After the destruction of Jerusalem, the Messianic church, the Jewish Christian church, along with the other Jews, they fled from this century and a half of Roman war against Israel, which was catastrophic. The Romans killed as many Jews during the century and a half of war against Israel as were killed in the Holocaust. About 1 in 3 of the Jewish population, of the Hebrew population worldwide. So there was this huge migration and immigration by both the Jews into Syria and Messianic church into Syria, and many of the Jews and Messianic Jewish Christians into Sepharad, the New Jerusalem. And they sought refuge there. And the result, and this is mentioned in the Bible actually, it's mentioned in Obadiah, that the captivity of Jerusalem, which is in Sepharad, shall return and possess the cities of the south. So Sepharad was a second Jerusalem to them. There in Sepharad, there was a golden age. There were so many Jews, they were so prosperous, that they began a huge labors in translating manuscripts that were coming from the East. Remember, Greek had been banned by the church. So many of the priceless Greek manuscripts had been lost as well. Classics of science, of Greek science. However, they had not disappeared. They had just gone into the East and been translated into Arabic. And now they were coming back into the West through Sepharad, and they are being translated back into the European languages by Messianic scribes. Messianic scribes who knew the 2 languages, who knew Arabic, who knew Hebrew, who knew the languages of the West. Well, a lot of Jewish scribes as well, but Messianics were more trusted because they had been converts. They were converts to Christianity. So they were more trusted by the Christian community that would be hiring them to translate these documents back into the Western languages. That is the source of the Renaissance in Europe, and eventually the Reformation as well. All of this knowledge, Europe went into a dark ages, and eventually that was broken open by all this flow of masterpieces back into the West that were translated by Messianic scribes and distributed all over Europe. And we know that there were early, it is reported that James actually went there. The Apostle James actually went to Spain. Paul also mentions it, that it was his journey that he deeply desired to take. Whenever, in Romans 15:24, whenever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you. And it is mentioned in historical documents that he did indeed make it there. And the reason would be that there was already a large community of Jewish Christians there, of Messianic Jews there in Sepharad. So early on, 1st century, they already had a Messianic Jewish Christian church going in Sepharad. So when there were about 500,000 Jews in the Middle Ages living in Spain, and about half of those converted. So you have a church, 250,000 Jewish Christians, a massive resurgence of the Messianic Apostolic Church. Now, some of them wanted to just integrate into the Western Church, leave, and they were pressured to leave all traces of Hebrew customs behind, and many of them just wanted to assimilate, wanted to do that. But then there were others that were equally convinced that if we're going to do this, this is a Hebrew story, about a Hebrew boy made good, about a Jewish Messiah. We're going to have this in the Holy Tongue in Hebrew. And they did so. They had their own bishops. They had their own churches. Right? They had their own Hebrew Gospels. And that is very clear from the evidence that we have, that there was a real part of this population that were true Messianics, true Jewish Christians who were following the Hebrew Messiah. And they were studying him in the Hebrew tongue. Now, about 1478, the Spanish Inquisition was begun in order to basically crush this Messianic church, because this was not the same church as the Latin church, and they didn't want the competition. And so they literally were starting the Inquisition in order to crush the resurgence of the Messianic church. A lot of people have heard of the Spanish Inquisition. Most people don't know that they had no authority over Jews, no authority over Muslims. They only had authority over Jews who had converted to Christianity. And them, they had the authority of life and death over them. And we know that almost all of their victims were Messianic converts, Jewish converts to Christianity. So there was a massive attempt to crush the resurgence of the Messianic church in Spain. They did not succeed, but they sure made a big mess trying. In 1492, now this is barely 10 years later, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he took many Messianics with him. Probably the Hebrew Gospels went on his ship. They had a Hebrew translator, expecting to run into other Hebrews that had been scattered all over the earth as they went there. He had a crew full of Jews and Messianics trying to escape either the expulsion of the Jews from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabel, or the persecution of the Inquisition of the Messianic Jewish Christians. So they came to the New World. The Hebrew Gospels themselves left with them and ended up in the Vatican Library, bound beneath another manuscript in Hebrew of about 100 pages. And there they remained undiscovered until 1956, when it was mentioned that there was a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So they were purposefully hidden, and it was successful. They sat there for 500 years without being discovered, until fairly recently in historical terms. There is so much more in this fascinating story of the survival of the Messianic church throughout the centuries up to the present day, and the survival of the Hebrew Gospels.
Dr. Miles Jones will be right back with more of The Writing of God.
Are your children behind in mathematics and reading, maybe in the godlier aspects of learning? We have the answer for you. We can take you through a homeschool curriculum that starts as early as 2 years old and teaches your children to read and do mathematics, or go through the levels of mathematics and reading all the way through high school. You can have a better day with your children, catch them up, and zip ahead of the crowd. Next, we're going to show you more secrets of the hidden origins of the Hebrew Gospels by comparing manuscripts separated by 2,000 years and 5,000 miles. Let's talk about the mystery of the first 3,000. Who were these people? This is a mystery that is critical, a missing page in history, and it is unveiled in my new book, Rediscovering the Zadokite Covenant of the First 3,000. It's a mystery that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai and the establishment of God's priestly order, all the way down to Zadok, the high priest of both King David and King Solomon, the man who built the first temple and on down to the first 3,000, what happened to this eternal priesthood? It was tossed out, and Israel never went back to it. This is the crucial discovery of what happened to the first 3,000, what brought them to the Jerusalem temple. And it will amaze you. It will reveal to you the Hebraic roots of our faith and the Messianic church, which started with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Shavuot in the Jerusalem temple in the first century. It's drawn from the Dead Sea Scrolls information, never before revealed much of it, from the Hebrew Gospels, and from the archaeological finds that we have recently made uncovering gold books from Arabia and from Damascus, which reveal a massive Zadokite diaspora throughout the Mideast. Mystery within a mystery within a mystery, all revealed to you in the book Unveiled, rediscovering the Zadokite covenant of the first 3,000 at writingofgod.com. That's writingofgod.com.
That's online at thewritingofgod.com. Online at thewritingofgod.com. Will you seek the Lord about becoming a partner to bring the message of the Writing of God to more people? Send your gift to The Writing of God, P.O. Box 294047, Kerrville, Texas 78029, or online at thewritingofgod.com. That's The Writing of God, P.O. Box 294047, Kerrville, Texas 78029, or online at thewritingofgod.com.